upcoming, we have Sergio CAREDDA. He's a self-proclaimed digital nomad, rebel, multi-potentialite, HR professional who believes in the human side of HR. Really like that. He's a thinker and a doer and likes crafting and changing things. So it will be no surprise that today he'll be talking to us about how to build intentional organizations. So Sergio.
A very nice introduction, and I'm very happy to be with you at this Stretch conference. I think it's a time where we all need to stretch our mind, and I think events like these make it really well happening. I heard already since yesterday some of the talks about how important it is to build on the reflection around organization and around how people act within the organization. So thanks again for the invitation. And what I will try to cover today, it's a concept that I've been crafting in my recent years of working, especially in digital transformation in a very large corporation, but it also lays on several years of experience now. I'm more than 20, as my white hair probably show. And the idea is this is not an additional organizational model. When I'm speaking about the intentional organization, is rather how to connect a lot of the ideas that you have already seen yesterday and this morning, and how to make sure that they are consistent within our organization. And the idea is to start with a quick mention of actually a writer which is very known. Deming was one of the leaders of the quality revolution. And he spoke about, with one quote, that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Reading it on the opposite side, if our organization today has issues in terms of performance or as issues in terms of productivity, probably there is a design element that is missing. And this is one element that has been driving probably a lot of transformation that we're doing. This morning, Otti, in his previous talk, has spoken about a lot of focus on leadership and a lot of other elements of from an organization design perspective. The point is that we are inundated by models. Today, we have thousands of different models that are kind of overwhelming us in terms of which one do I choose? How do I approach that? I've been writing a couple of articles on my blog, and I've listed more than 130 leadership models, for example, more than 50 organizational models. And the question is, which one is the good one for us? Which one is the one that we should be using? And the idea is that probably this is the wrong question, because an organization is not something that you can just buy off the shelf. And successful organizations are successful because they are very different and they are very unique. And in a way, it's what also Henry Mitzberg already told in the past, that a lot of us think about organization design as something that, it's like a Lego piece. We can buy one piece, attach it here, do it in another way. But the reality is not like this, because it's not that there is an organizational bazaar out there where we can just buy the pieces from an organization perspective that fits our model and then take it from there. And this is where what I try to represent with my concept, because it helped drive also a transformation, like a digital transformation, which is not just about technology, but is also about an organization evolution. I've been calling this organization evolution framework. And this is, again, as I mentioned, is not a new organization model, but it's rather a list and a visual map that connects all of the existing organizational building blocks. Okay, these are really like the Lego pieces that you have. And the thing is that every organization has them all: business model, a strategy, an operating model, an organization model, whether you want it or not. And here comes the point. If one of these, think about leadership, think about the corporate culture, think about the purpose, think about the ecosystem intended really about the networking of all the relationship that your organization creates with, okay? If you don't really understand which one of this building block is written on, or which one is really has been intentionally designed, that's where a problem lies. That's where the issues also with the performance can be. And the element, as you see, this is a balance also between how we would call them soft elements, like leadership, culture, etc., and hard elements. But actually, this is also a wrong way of seeing them, because a lot of these can be emergent, and we will see that later on. A lot of them can be designed, actually, also in an intentional way. I want to give an example of one element or of an organization which is often copied in one of its ways, just to actually show how addressing only one of the need from our organization, only on one of the building blocks, can actually create issues. The example comes from Spotify, and it's about scaling agile. Otti this morning actually spoke about ING being one of the organizations that has been scaling agile pretty successfully. And they've actually used what is defined as the Spotify model. But actually, one of the problems that many organizations have is that they think that agile is only there at the organization model perspective. I change a couple of job titles. I change what was a project manager into Scrum Master. I create a couple of Scrum team, or call them squad in the Spotify language, and I'm done. But actually, that's not how Spotify works on its own. The origin of the Spotify model comes from a couple of videos which were really talking about an engineering culture. They were talking about how this organization had taken the concept of Scrum and adapted to the organization. And so the reality about what really makes Spotify work is actually the consistency between all of these elements. So there is a business model that, of course, Spotify has and is under our eyes, which is a customer-focused one. They have a clear strategy of technology and content innovation, and the balance between content and technology is really clear. They, of course, have a consistent operating model. If you go back and look at those videos about the Spotify culture, you will see, for example, how important the release cycle of technology was for the organizational model that Spotify was using. Then they do have a distributed leadership model, and actually, if you look back, those videos were from 2008. If you look back from now until back in 2008, Spotify has evolved enormously also from a leadership perspective. And it's not just the agile coaches that were named back then, but it's a lot more, and it has been insisting on this. There is a strong culture which was focused on engineering. Today, it's also focused on content production, a shared purpose that guarantees alignment. There is an entire ecosystem that is embedded into the strategy. Think about all of the application, all of the provider where Spotify is today embedded into that. And then, yes, there was also an organizational model, something that was loosely based on the Scrum concept, the Scrum Alliance concept, and that has been reinterpreted on the needs in the organization. So this slide actually shows you also why it's impossible to copy something like the Spotify model, because you would not be able to copy all of the elements of an organization, because otherwise you would be cloning Spotify, which probably would not make at all sense. And here comes really one of the elements that for me, it's really critical here. Because if you think about all of these 8 elements, again, as I was mentioning, this does not mean that you need to stop your organization, sit down and think and write and dedicate enormous amounts of time to craft each of these individually. A lot of them might be willing to exist already. The question is, are we able to respond to a number of questions, each of these questions being part of the model as it is built? The first one is, what makes us unique as an organization? Because do we have clear what our value proposition is as an organization? Do we know what our priorities, what are the strategic choices that we actually have? What is our value delivery chain? How is that we create value in our organization? Do we have that clear? What is our definition of work, and how do we structure this in our organization? What is our leadership style, and how do we stitch it all together? Do we really think in terms of intentional design in our organization? What is our definition of good in our organization? How is value meant for us? Is it just financial? Is it just really profit? Is there something else behind that? What is our level of consistency? How is that we make it work all together around this? And how do we know it will last? A lot of our organization today, especially in a crisis like the one that we have today, are really wondering, how long will my organization last? But the concept here is, did we design it so that we can also sustain with resilience and anti-fragility the current scenario? So all these calls to a new definition of performance. And in previous conversation around some of these questions, the problem that arose from some organizations, and I would like also to ask for your feedback maybe later on during the Q&A session, is that, well, yes, our organization has all these answers, but very often these answers are in specific pockets or in specific buckets or in specific silos in our organizations. For example, we might have a strategy teams that knows perfectly what our priorities are. And we have somebody maybe in supply chain that knows our value delivery chain, okay? But that's the point. The entire organization needs to be aware of this, because the consistency is exactly that. It is expressed by making sure that we have a total alignment on the organization around these elements. So if we think of an organization that is truly successful and that is intentional around this, okay, which essentially means that everybody is able to answer to those 8 questions that I just posed, it's the clear example of organizational intentionality. This is where really people feel confident, comfortable, when they understand how things work through, when everything between the organization and their ecosystem is seamless. You have maximum customer experience in this organization. You have a goal and understanding of the role of work. Everybody is understanding things because they're consistent. And this is a very important element, because we can recognize many organizations that are consistent here without necessarily attaching to it an ethical statement about this system is the best, this system doesn't work, or this system is good, this system is bad. And here comes one of the points about why do we need to think in terms of intentionality. Well, I'm using an interesting parallel with a physical concept of entropy. It's the idea of this big energy level. And you know that there is kind of the thermodynamic law states that entropy is going to actually get down to annihilate itself over a period of time. The idea is that when you create an organization, think about a startup, you have a high level of entropy, you have high level of energy within that organization. These organizations that normally are very robust, they tend to be speedy, they're very non-focused. They can be magmatic and destructured. The point is that if we just look at the entropy level, what happens is that there is almost this continuum that goes from this traditional entropic organization to what some have defined as a negentropic organization, where there is low entropy. Things are starting to get stuck. These are organizations that are fragile, they're slow, they're very rational, they're insular, they're overstructured. We can call them bureaucratic. And you probably know many examples of this organization. And the question is, how do we make sure we can be in between of these? Okay, that's where I think that the concept of an intentional organization sits, because the idea is to stimulate an sense-making concept within our organization, a mechanism which through a continuous cycle of awareness, meaning, and experimentation allows us to continuously engage with the building blocks that we met. None of them is set up forever. They need to be staying there until they work. So you have an organization that then can, through this, become anti-fragile, agile, consistent, integrated, right-structured. On my blog, for example, I have analyzed, based on some recent books that came out, two organizations that are a very different one from each other. One is Netflix, the other is Basecamp. Now, one of the elements is that with two entrepreneurs that have different visions of the world, I would say, of the economy and of how to structure an organization. But both of the organizations are consistent. You can probably deliver a lot of very sound critiques on some of the principles that Netflix puts forward, like, for example, the fact that there is a big severance package attached to good performance. But on the other side, if you think about it, that reflects, and you look at the great success that the company has, it actually links to the fact that there is a strong consistency behind this. And this is the element that I think we need to consider. And both organizations have both been on a journey where things are getting changed over time. One of the elements, again, about Netflix doesn't have a travel policy or almost no travel policy, exactly because it wants to go away from traditional bureaucratic recipe. So the idea is that if you think about intentionally designing your organization, you're really connecting to what this morning Otti mentioned, which is the importance of leadership. And intentional design is exactly that. It's an act of deliberate and purposeful leadership. Every manager in the organization, or, well, for that matter, everybody in the organization, with every action is contributing either to the build-up of the intentional organization or to the detriment of this. If somebody is just building a rule to keep its own power, that's going to be a detriment to the organizational intentionality as a whole. If instead we're all trying to align and constantly challenge ourselves on what is needed or what is not, we're really going to help and build this organization in terms of intentional design. There is on this, another important capability that we need to then develop as an organization to really understand where are we on that. I gave the example before of a startup. You know, you're creating an organization, that's the moment of maximum energy. That's also a moment where, well, you probably are going to write something about the business model because you need to apply for funds. You're probably going to write something about the strategy and probably a first org chart. But you're not going to really think a lot around a lot of this element. This is a phase where we can call it of emergent design. So there are a lot of elements of the organization which are going to be built. Let's think about the culture. Let's think about the leadership style. Let's think also about the purpose of the organization, okay? And that are going to stick for a lot of time, even if nobody sat down around the table and actually did a design phase around it. Usually, an organization then starts building up on that. You know, the original entrepreneur starts bringing in some other leaders in the organization, some other executives. And what they're going to bring in are the experiences from previous companies. This is the contamination phase, okay? This is what happens where, you know, you have been building something with a background from pure entrepreneurship, and then you hire somebody that is coming from consulting, somebody from technology, and they all bring a little bit of their pocket of contribution. Sometimes can be a policy, sometimes can be a piece of performance management or elements like this. So again, a step of emergent design. And a lot of companies kind of get stuck into this element and slowly fade into a third element, which is the bureaucratic phase, which is a little bit the parallel to what I showed before in terms of the negantropic organization. You end up building bureaucracy as you grow simply because you let the rules build up bottom up. Every manager builds up its own small rules without thinking of the big picture. That's why it's important to recognize at which stage we are to start understanding how we can really build intentional design in our organization. Some organizations start thinking about it through what I've defined as compliance phase. In many countries, there is a moment in which either because you're growing or because maybe there is an IPO behind coming near, or because you have a new round of funding, or because there are other legislation, you need to actually look at your organizational model and write something down. That's the compliance phase. Is it the good way of starting? Well, probably it's not the most motivated one, but definitely it's anyway a good point, because anyway it allows you to analyze the organization. That's then, as many organizations start instead experimenting. And this is where instead there is somebody into a bucket of the organization that feels, you know what, we actually need to be more agile. We actually need to deliver software in an agile way because everybody else is doing that. And so they start experimenting that. This is something that is very important because the reality as we see it today is that most organizations, even if formally they are a structured hierarchical bureaucracy, they practically work a lot more by project, by cross-functional teams. There are pockets of agile. The problem is that a lot of this is not recognized as a true experiment. And it's not built up. We're looking at the result of the project, but not on the organizational learning that we gain from that. And I think this is an important element of reflection about this awareness cycle. And the last piece is the consistency phase, which is really when we start thinking of how do I get all this experiment lined up to make things happen in a different way. If I can go back at an example, I think that a very interesting learning about the ING case that Otti mentioned this morning rather quickly is the fact that they understood that, yes, they were copying, they were taking inspiration from the Spotify model. But of course, banking is a totally different industry. They needed actually to implement it in a different way, and they needed to think about the consistency. And also, as they started addressing different countries, they also had to realize that you cannot apply then everything like with a rubber stamp from one country to another. And also there, the consistency phase, again, it's intentional design. You need to look at the global picture. What this also means is that because what you in reality want is that your organization is having both emergent and intentional design at the same time. Because you're always going to experiment, there is always going to be that project, there is always going to be that innovation aspect in an organization. So what you actually want is not a model that becomes static. In the 70s, there was this idea in management literature, which was the congruence model, which told that, you know what, you need to write your vision, your mission, your values, your strategy, etc., and everything needs to be connected. And then your organization will be living forever happy. That doesn't really happen because, well, forever happy, just think about what COVID brought today in terms of uncertainty. That simply does not exist. We need to create something that changes with the environment. And that's why it's important to recognize that you need to build in your organization design a few tension mechanisms that are going to be positive for you because they are going to help that cycle of awareness that I mentioned. The first one is a positive obsession of really looking at the fact that everything that you're doing needs to be deliberate and intentional. You're running a new project. Good. Let's make sure I have deliberate and intentional learning out of the structure that is adopted. You need to think in terms of coherence. All elements need to exist together. Again, if I go back to my experience in digital transformation, everybody tells it today, digital transformation is not about technology. What COVID has demonstrated us is that in 2 weeks, most of the organization got the technology right. But the people dimension, which is one strong element of our operating model and our organization model, it's something that takes more time, or our corporate culture. You see, you can never do a project just on one area. You need to think about the impacts of consistency and coherence. Ambiguity. Now, we all know that ambiguity is very often perceived as a word as something negative. But the reality, as Otti mentioned today, is that our organization needs to become more and more ambidextrous, and we need to start liking ambiguity. Because innovation and anti-fragility in our organization starts from the fact that they're a system that lives on their paradoxes. The really good organization are those that can do both agile and waterfall in software development. The really good organization are those that are both hierarchical and allow self-organization today. These are the elements that I think we need to be considering. And then truth. This is a very important aspect. There is no absolute truth. There is no model that is good or bad. Okay, there is no model that is absolutely the best in every situation. And this goes down to the discussion of a couple of elements that we will see in a second that I think it's very important. What we need to be sharing is that we need to be defining within our organization what the real truth means for us. And this is where, as I was mentioning, we need to start considering that our organizations live in an ecosystem, okay, with a big environment outside. And our organization constantly exchange within this ecosystem what I've been defining flows of meaning, okay? And these are about, so our organization, and you have the big amount of stakeholders, several different types of stakeholders, and a big part of them are the workers, not just employees. But there are different type of workers that interact with our organizations. And the point is that we need to think about two very important sources of meaning. The meaning of work, which is really this relationship that actually gets people to sit together and create an organization in first place, and the meaning of value, okay, which is the broader exchange that our organization gets with the environment. Now, we are coming from about 100 years where all of this, okay, has been kind of concentrated in financial concepts. So we think our meaning of value is profit, and it's actually profit for one specific area of stakeholder, for one specific stakeholder, which are shareholders. And the meaning of work is actually also money in terms of wages and in terms of productivity and efficiency gains. The reality is that this model, if you just look at it from an economic perspective, got broken. And the reason is that up until the 70s, the early 80s, the idea were that organizations were producing efficiencies to drive profit, and they were also taking that efficiency and bringing it back to the workers in terms of less time worked or increased wages. But then what happens in the 80s is we started going outside, we started doing offshoring, we started doing outsourcing, and something broke there, because the meaning itself of work has been put under discussion. Today we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about the risk of automation, okay? And the question here is, a lot of people are working more, being paid a lot less, and the risk is that also our organization will start suffering very soon. A few days ago was the anniversary of when Henry Ford put in place the first assembly line in the US. What is interesting is that we always use the concept of the assembly line as the most dehumanizing aspect of scientific management. And for many areas, it is. But Henry Ford was also one person that actually looked at those productivity gains to actually increase the salaries of its workforce and actually decrease the hours at work. It's the first company that actually got to less than 40 hours per week. So I think we need to consider that. And as we think about our organizational model and our purpose, we need to think, what is our organization standing for in terms of meaning and in terms of value? I've been investigating a lot this meaning of work. On my blog, you will find a number of pretty long articles where I try to look at the history, because today we always see everything from the eyes of the concept of the employment contract. But really, the employment contract started appearing at the end of the 19th century. We have had many different meanings of work before, and I truly think that today there is a new meaning of work that is formed. And this comes down to what I mentioned before. Thinking in terms of how we deliver meaning means also that we need to think in a different way at how our organizational performance is defined. You remember the 8 elements that I mentioned before, those 8 questions. That's the way you drive performance in an organization. And it is actually achieved when all the organizational components are balanced together. Recently, I heard a quote about somebody saying, the idea is that you should always be treating your best employees as volunteers, because that's what they are. Because if they're really your best employees, they could be leaving every moment. Volunteers, that's an interesting aspect, because there are thousands of organizations out there, non-profit, that live because of volunteers. And those are organizations that have been tackling this idea of organizational performance in a different way before. Not just because of the P&L, but because they actually know they need to have financial resources, but they're driving something more in terms of the meaning of work for the people that are there. And I think that this also leads to my last slide, which also means that we need to redefine innovation. Innovation today is more and more not just the capability to deliver a nice, good, new product or a new service, but it's also a capability to deliver distinctive and sustainable value, also by innovating your organizational model. And actually, it's true. If you look at the cases of the of the better winning organization of the past 10 years, they've all been innovative in terms also of the organizational model. And this is the idea really from my perspective to really drive intentionality as something that really helps and support us in building bridges within our organization, in building bridges with the outside world, in not thinking that just that change should happen because, oh, I've just read the last management book about a new wonderful model and let's implement it. Because the world is full of half-made implementation of past projects. And what we don't do is instead learn what we actually need to do in our organization. I want to conclude with one good point. I think that this concept about self-managing organization that actually are purpose-oriented, etc., it's something that today it's becoming more and more sound, not because Lalou has written about it, because that's kind of a book that has been read by many, but kind of on the edges of the real managerial world. But this is a period where a lot of the big consulting firms, McKinsey, BCG, etc., are talking about this concept. And the reality is that these organizations have been often among those that have caused issues in creating organizations that are too structured and organized. But I always see the positive aspect around it. It's really, as Otti mentioned today, it's really the start of a big revolution. And through new leadership, we can really help finding a new way to drive our intentional organization. Here are my contact data, but I will be happy to answer any question, Jose, that have already appeared, and I will also be sitting later on for a little bit more time in one breakout room to answer also directly any other questions that might raise.
Thank you, Sergio. A lot there. I really like this whole disrupting innovation in a way that's distinctive and sustainable value. I think sustainable is key. Yeah, I see a lot of people doing disruptive innovation, but then suddenly crumble through that, right? And they have to kind of just. So for people attending, remember the chat. Please write your questions to Sergio. Sergio would also be joining us in our hop-in session for a longer session of Q&A. We had a fun ask here. How many leadership models do you know? I like this one. A little fun ask here.
No, well, that's an interesting point. At the moment, you will find an article on my blog that lists 125 of these. I've actually collected 40 more. I just need to update the article. It takes a little bit of time. Also because there are more and more people sending them over. And this is, somebody asked me, why are you doing this? And this is just for me to explain the fact that it's useless to try to find the absolutely best leadership model. They're all useful to us in a certain way or a certain time. A few of them have really some academic background. Some are old, okay? Management literature and knowledge has evolved in the past century. But beside this, most of them have an intuition, an element that is positive or good if you're taking it. The question is always this: you cannot just take one and blindly apply it in your organization just because it looks good on paper.
Yes, and that's a really common mistake, right? You think like, well, that organization's successful, just copy paste over here, and I'm going to be successful. That's a really, really common mistake. And yeah, just learn from there, see how it applies over here, and iterate, right? That's the whole purpose. Do we have another question here around? You mentioned the concept of treating star employees like volunteers. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is it happened in a recent webinar where somebody mentioned it as a quote on really the fact that within many organizations should be looking at their top employees, their high potential, the high performer, have people that are really chosen to stay in that organization. Volunteer, it's coming from that point of view, because if they're really among the top performer, they should be they would probably have many chances of finding another job somewhere else, okay? So the concept is, how is that you treat volunteers? Volunteers, you don't treat them by simply remunerating them more. You need to give them meaning, okay? And this is a very interesting advice. However, let me do one step back and also mentioning something that is pretty dangerous sometimes when we in an organization select the top few, the high potential, the best few, etc. I think we're coming from a legacy of the last 20 years where HR has shifted with a lot of focus on development, on really caring for the individuals. And very often, because we didn't have that much money, we cared only for the few individuals that were at the top. But at the top, based on what? We have done so many potential assessments, And we have had so many hypos in organizations that have never really become top performer. So here, this is one of the questions that I think it's important. I think we need, as HR, also to put an organizational lens. We need to look at the connectivity points between individual and organization. And we need to make sure that what we are offering to the individual is really a source of that meaning. Also because we cannot concentrate on the 10%, 15%. We very often get Pareto law wrong from this point of view. Yes, very often few people have a very important impact in our organization. But we have seen it this year with the COVID. The cashiers at the supermarkets, the nurses in the hospitals. These are the people that are less paid in many organizations, okay, but have had a disruptive effect in keeping us alive as a society for a period of time. So very often, I think we need to reflect around that. We need to avoid what, again, in a conference I've heard, distinguishing our organization between hypos and the rest, because the rest can quickly become hypos. Okay, I've heard this several years ago in another conference, which is passed over and pissed off, okay, which is really like the people that, in that case, are not going to volunteer, in that case, are going to look for the next possible chance and exit the organization. So the exact concept of volunteering goes back to looking for what is the meaning of work for some of the people. And I think it connects very well with yesterday's introductory speech about when you're looking about building a remote organization, a distributed organization, you need to balance and interpret also, because a lot of people find meaning in work because they see their colleagues at work every day. So closing their offices and like disrupting everything from over one day might not be the good answer for them. And I think it's just a question very often of listening to the people.
I really love that answer. And somewhat to a follow up here, what do you think about medium employees, right? So we talked about the star, treating them as volunteer. So what about the next layer down?
Yeah, exactly. I think that there has been, in recent years, there has been a lot of focus when you're looking at self-organizing companies, a lot of focus about getting away with the middle management because it's almost seen as evil. Well, the point is, and I think we need to be very clear around that we need to have frontline employees because they're actually delivering the value. They're actually the only one that speak with our customers, so we need them. But we also need to have in our organization some kind of layer that is able to coach, is able to mentor, is able to transfer competencies, is able to develop, is able to innovate. The problem is if we think about managers only as controllers. That thing needs to go away. But that doesn't mean that we need to eject entire levels from our organization. Sometimes, yes, we need to reform our organization in terms of diminishing the hierarchy levels, but we need to focus on reinventing the role of people. And we need to consider that too often we also see, well, our top employees are actually the ones that sit at the top of our organization. I don't think it that way. I've had a long tradition. I've had a long experience working in retail, and I've always found that a lot of really extraordinary employees are sitting in our stores. They're the ones that speak with the customer, and very often they actually have better hold of the customer needs than a person that sits in its ivory tower in the head office. I think that new organizational model will be successful if they're able to reinvent the pact that should exist between the people and the organization. It should not be anymore a top-down approach. It should be really the concept of the inverted pyramid, which again is not a new concept. It's something that is also coming from the 70s, but that makes things work. And we should really think about the role of everybody that's sitting in the organization. Think about, again, what I mentioned before in my example about Spotify. They have really done a great job in creating this distributed leadership with people that are not just leader in terms of manager, meaning controller, but they're coaching others. They're really helping the organization grow all together. This is, I think, something that we need to work on and we need to consider more and more.
And kind of to change it up a bit, In emergent design, you mentioned the different phases, right?
Yes.
Is it important to diagnose where you are? Like, what is the importance of, is there anything there to do?
Well, I think that sometimes it's important to kind of diagnose where you are. And I've started my career in a small consulting firm that was really focused on cultural audit. And this is the piece that, when you enter a company, very often you're going to find a good business model, a strategy, great org charts, and sometimes also an operating model. The thing is that very often all the rest is going to be left out until somebody sees it from a bureaucratic point of view. Sometimes you find that, well, there is a leadership model. And I'm meaning a bureaucratic point of view because, well, you know what, we needed to build an assessment to recruit new people. And so we've built a leadership competency model. I think that sometimes it's good to actually assess where you are in some of these elements, but not the traditional way in terms of browsing for the documents and reading what is there, but looking exactly at those 8 questions and looking at how many people in the organization can actually answer to those. And not just answer, but answer coherently. Because I think it's the point about that awareness is making sure that you understand that there are those 2 phases, okay? And also understanding that in both phases there is value, because emergent design very often leads to very good intentional design, and intentional design needs what has been formed out of emergent design. Again, I don't think that there is an organization today that can say, stop the train, we're going to spend 3 months on redesigning everything, because in 3 months the world will have changed so much that we're going to be in trouble. But understanding, and this is probably where I think good leaders really have a strong impact in terms of their own, so it's not just an organizational capability, but also leadership one, of understanding where we stand. And often understanding it not just for the entire organization, but also for the division, for the function, for the team, because all of these elements exist at all levels in the organization.
I think we got one more question. You mentioned around the continuous tension, or like
Yes.
having that organization and that tension is good. But how can you define too much tension, right? Where it becomes then counterproductive?
Yes, well, that tension needs to be really seen and exploited from that sense-making cycle that I've mentioned. Those tensions are those that should help us having awareness, should help us having a measurement of the results, should help us go into experimentation. That's the way where I see you can really build up on positive tensions. I am with you that sometimes we tend to have tensions that build up ambiguity. How often do you read job descriptions on the web where navigating ambiguity is one of the top competencies? Well, if it's the external ambiguity, that's normal. You should not be fighting. But very often, a lot of those job descriptions are telling that you need to navigate the internal ambiguity in the organization, because especially if you're a matrix organization, there is a lot around that. Well, those are the examples where you can recognize that ambiguity can be diminished by good design. Because very often, I'll just make one stupid example, the problem with ambiguity is that nobody really cared about defining who manages the performance. Is it my line manager or my functional manager? So you see, I think the importance is looking at this tension and looking which one can I solve or can I contribute to reduce through design, but without the ambition to really close them off, because those are a source of energy.
So I said one more, but there's one that snuck in. I will get it in. So
that's fine.
What is your recommendation for company level sense making, as this is the cornerstone of emergent design?
Yes. Well, for me, that sense making needs to become a practice within the organization. I have the feeling that sometimes sense making is seen like is also sold in a certain way, packaged as we all sit down a tree and hug a tree and try to make sense of the world. But the reality is that sense making can be very, very practical. It's about thinking, okay, about what you have done and what you have achieved, and listening, especially to the outside ecosystem. I give one example. I think that one of the key elements of why Agile as a way of developing software has been successful is because it embeds within it the concept of retrospective, which is essentially a sense-making element that is actually done as part of the ceremonies that are done within the Agile framework. Then not everybody is able to capture all of the value that you can have, but the fact of doing a moment in which you see how good have we been and my customers are in as well, it's actually one of the best way of doing sense-making. Again, if I just can make an example, if you think about retail, but think about e-commerce, think about all these organizations that have grassroots customer-facing employees. Those are doing sense-making every day because they're talking with the customer. Are you as an organization a way to capture that, not transform it into big data, because if it enters that black box, you will never really find it out, but transform it into an innovative idea. That's what we actually need to have, really create a radar around this as an organizational capability.
Well, thank you again, Sergio. Like I mentioned before, he's going to be around for the Q&A session, so right in the break. But Sergio, we're going to be sending you this as a little keepsake from the conference. So we'll be packaging that up and getting that to you.
Thank you.